Welcome back to AP World History and our second part of the Mongols. We're going to now look at the areas the Mongols conquered and the societies they set up, and then the effects of the Mongols. So, first off, they go after China. Genghis Khan begins the attacks in 1209 because the Mongols need new food and are running out in the steppes for their people because the population's growing, and they start taking over northern China. Now, he won't fully conquer China. His goal was to fully conquer China. He doesn't. He dies in trying to suppress some revolts in 1227 by falling off his horse, as we talked about earlier. But his grandson will achieve that accomplishment. Kublai Khan will establish the Yuan dynasty there, knocking out the Song dynasty, and um, he will adopt a lot of the Chinese customs, things like the bureaucracy, bringing in a little bit of Confucianism, but not a ton of it. Um, and he will also reject some major parts of it. For example, foot binding, he views as terrible, and the Mongol people go, "Why would you do that to women?" Not necessarily that they care so much about women's rights. I mean, there's maybe a little bit that they have women at a higher status than what the Chinese women are, but women can't ride horses. Then it's not possible for them to ride horses if they have their foot binded or bound, and so. They look at it from that point. You can't do it. The women can't do anything. They're stuck at home and they can't help out. Also, the Mongols will praise merchants and raise merchants from the lowest status level, which the Confucius absolutely abhor because Confucius said, "What the merchants? They don't do anything. They don't do anything. They just trade, and they take people's products that they worked hard on and then sell it for a higher profit, and they make a lot of profit off of it. They're not adding to society, which." Conflicts with the Mongols' view of it, as merchants do add to society. They bring in new things. They bring in things that weren't in the region before, and that's something that the Mongols really like. And so they praise merchants, and that's part of the reason why we'll see the Silk Road is revitalized during this time. Now, the Yuan weren't perfect. They don't last a very long time. They last about 70 years, or actually less than 70 years, about 50 years or so, and that's partially because Kublai Khan was a great leader and his sons weren't that great, but also they tried to invade Japan, and trying to attack Japan is like trying to attack Britain. It's an island, and it's very difficult to do, and you have really choppy and stormy waters in between the two areas. Very rarely has Britain been conquered, and Japan has never really been conquered by outside sources, except for maybe you could say the U.S. during World War II, and that wasn't because we did an invasion in there, but because of what we did in the surrounding areas. So um, they failed to conquer Japan. They send a fleet of ships over with men, but they get caught up in a typhoon, which is like a hurricane, or is a hurricane, just uh, in the Pacific Ocean, and destroys most all of the ships and the people that were there. So millions of people, or not millions, but thousands of people die in this. Some of the ships will make it to Japan and put on a fighting effort against the Japanese, but the Japanese have far superior numbers and are able to fend off the few Mongols that get onto the shore. So this will eventually lead to the fall of the dynasty and the rise of the Ming dynasty, which is the last true Chinese dynasty. And the Ming bring back the ideas of Confucianism and bring back foot binding and lower merchants on their status that they were at. So that's China. After Genghis Khan had started to invade China and had kind of secured what he wanted to secure there, he then moved west and went towards the Islamic world. And in 1219, he begins attacking the Islamic world. And by 1251, it gets conquered by the Mongols. This, again, is much after the death of Genghis Khan. But his grandson Hulagu will conquer the region. He will destroy the city of Baghdad and really destroy a lot of the architecture and everything else and public works and things that the area really relied on. Because the Mongols don't value it. They look at it as, oh, that's for agriculture and that's not a big deal. We want more area to raise our animals. And so they want to see things going back to grasslands. However, Gohazan, a later leader, of the Mongols in the area decides Islam isn't too bad, and what we did was maybe not entirely the best thing to do for the people, and so he tried to fix some of the bad things they did. He tries to rebuild some of those public works, and this will start to put the Mongols on a course to eventually assimilate with the Muslims in the region, and the Mongols will disappear there. So, unlike China, where they get kicked out, here they actually get absorbed by the society. The people in the region bring them in, and eventually they're no longer pastoralists; they're farmers, and they have completely become a part of that culture and society. One sad note with Baghdad, when that gets sacked, you lose a major library and university there. And it's a very kind of sad day for historians and whatnot, because there are a lot of great texts there, some really ancient Greek ones that have been translated that we might have today if it didn't burn down, very similar to what happens with the Library of Alexandria when it burns down. So it's an unfortunate thing that happened, but it was a way that the Mongols were able to gain control and show that they have control. So, moving on though, a little bit north, we have Russia and Europe, and the Mongols terrorized the region. In 1237, the Mongols began to attack Rus, and this group of Mongols is known as the Golden Horde. So this is much after, about 10 years after Genghis Khan had died. But they begin to attack Rus in their main city of Kiev, and they sack it and destroy it. But the Mongols don't actually like go and stay there and occupy it like we see happen in China and in the Middle East. Instead, they stay on the outsides in an area where they can still be pastoralist, but they do exert their control. And to exert that control, though, they're going to need some people on the inside or in that area that help them out. And the city of Moscow rises up to that occasion. And this is why Moscow becomes a major city, and why it's a major city today, and why things don't revolve around Kiev, which used to be kind of the major city center, or the major city in the region, major urban area. And the princes of Moscow paid homage to the Mongols. They work with them. They collect the taxes. They do all kind of the dirty work that they need to do in there for them, and that will allow the Mongols to control the area. But it will also be the Mongols' downfall in the area, because the princes will figure out, okay, this is what the Mongols are doing, and we're going to now use this against them. And they eventually push them out in 1380. So about 50 years, less than 50 years later, about 40 years later, they get pushed out. Also, one thing to also note here is, yes, they did a lot of damage in Russia, or what would later become Russia, and they almost did a lot of damage in Europe. However, after defeating the Germans in 1240, they were planning on going further, but they decided not to and stuck to where they were to keep control there, partially because of divisions that were happening back in Central Asia between the grandsons of Genghis Khan and how things were being divided. So there wasn't necessarily as much of a need to go and push out and conquer more land. So this was a threat that allowed Europe to kind of stay as it was and not be conquered by the Mongols and have the same terrible effects that the Middle East, China, and Russia had of the exertion of taxes and the high death tolls from the wars. And we'll see what happens with Europe after this, because this is actually a key thing as why Europe rises to the level it does when it does. So this is what the Mongol Empire looks like. You got the Ilkhan, that's where they adopt and assimilate to Islamic culture. You have the Golden Horde, which then that green area is the Russian states that they control but don't fully control. They have them kind of run things for them. You have the Empire of Kublai Khan throughout all of China and even into what is today Russia and all the way down into Vietnam. And then you have the Jagatai Empire, which is in Central Asia, around the steppes in Central Asia. And so it gets divided up between these four groups, mostly the four grandsons. And this division will lead to the weakening of the Mongol Empire, and is why it disappears after about 70 years or so after it started. Or, well, more than 70 years, about 90 years after it started, or 80 years. So, if you're living in these areas, you might be wondering, well, what's it like? And so the Mongols are, if you survive the initial wars, if you weren't in the military, or if you were a skilled worker, it'll turn out pretty well. If you're just a commoner, it might not be as good for you. But they promote trade. This is where we get people like Marco Polo traveling across the Silk Road. They attract scholars and then disperse them throughout the empire. So new ideas and knowledge spreads throughout this. They practice religious tolerance. So you have Buddhists allowing to practice what they want. You have Nestorian Christians. You have Latin Christians. You have Eastern Orthodox Christians. They're able to practice what they want. The Latin and Western Church Christians will try to the Pope will try to convert the Mongols to Christianity, which doesn't work. But they try it. Taoists, Muslims, everyone is accepted for what they believe in, as long as they don't try to force it on other people. And if they do try to force it on other people, or they don't listen to the rules that the Mongols have laid down, then you get the brutality that you know about with the Muslims, or that you might have heard about, or that the history sources tell us about with the Muslims and that, or with the Mongols, that they go and destroy, and they will erase whole cities and groups of people. Now, some of those effects of this are, we see with that trade, okay, the Silk Road is reinvigorated. And this is a big deal, one, for the Silk Road and the cities along it, but more, it gets Europe back into this trade, and Europe sees this as, ooh, this is a major opportunity to make a lot of money. And we don't want to travel across the land, though. Instead, let's see if we can go by sea. And so this leads to this movement of trying to go by sea. As well, they know about the Indian Ocean trade, and they're participating in that, so they want to get around the Silk Road and be able to get directly to Asia, where the silk and the spices are. And so this will be part of the reason why we get the exploration in 1492 with Columbus, and before that with the Portuguese. You also have the spread of knowledge, like those scholars and artisans are spread throughout the empire, so that brings new ideas of medicines like acupuncture, and the idea that you have a pulse and how to read that. It brings new farming techniques throughout the empire, and new crops such as carrots spread around. So you have lots of ideas and people and everything else moving around and making life better for everyone. And then you have the Black Death, which isn't a very positive thing. About 75 to 200 million people die. We don't have exact numbers because there weren't exact censuses or anything like that to go by. But on the low end, it's about 75 million, maybe more like 100 million, but it could be up on the highest end, 200 million people. And the world population at the time was about 450 million people. So we lose about a third to maybe close to half of the world population. And this causes some major problems. One, it causes some people to close down their borders and say, oh, we're not going to trade anymore. Others, they can't trade anymore because they don't have any workers or people to go trade because so many people have died. And so trade grinds to a halt, which then really hurts the Mongols. They can't bring in their taxes and things anymore, and so they lose their power and get pushed back to their homeland in Central Asia. But at the same time, this will allow the Europeans to rise. Europe, although is hit hard by the Black Death, recovers quickly, and they have gained all the technology from the rest of the world that spread across the Silk Road, and they will be able to rise up and become the Mongols of the sea with their conquests and their establishment of empires in the Americas, in Southeast Asia, on the borders of India, on the borders of East Africa. And so they adopt everything that comes through this, and they weren't as affected as other regions in being destroyed and losing major city centers. And so they will take advantage of the fall of the Mongol Empire and rise up and take their place.